Well, my name is Paul James with the Knoxville History Project. I just have a few quick announcements, and then I'm going to turn screen over to Jack Neely to introduce Norman Shaw for tonight's program. So thanks again for joining us. If you don't know that we are the Knoxville History Project, we've been doing these weekly Zooms since May the 15th last year. We've had 2 weeks off and still going. Our mission is pretty simple. It's our educational nonprofit with a mission to research and promote the history and culture of Knoxville. And as you know, if you've been watching these, there are many different facets to the history of this town. We are recording tonight, and we post our recorded versions on our portal section of knoxvillehistoryproject.org, where you can go to the podcasts and dialogues. And Nicole puts them up usually in the next couple of days. Last week is not on yet because we've had a little snitch with the software, but Nicole's diligently working on it. Also want to thank Council members Lynn Fugate and Charlie Thomas for giving a donation through local 202 funds. Thanks so much for them to help underwrite the cost of the work that goes into put this series together. So thanks to Lynn and Charles. And I'm going to hand it over to Jack. Jack, take it away and introduce our speaker tonight. Thank you.
All right. Thanks very much, Paul, and thanks everybody for joining us. And thanks, as always, to our multi-talented coordinator, Nicole Stahl, for helping us with this every week. We're going to be talking this evening about Knoxville's connection to the worst maritime disaster in United States history, which happened 156 years ago this month on April 27th. Would be next Tuesday, would be the anniversary of it. And talk about why we have one of the nation's most impressive monuments to a disaster that happened 400 miles away. And we're honored tonight to have Norman Shaw, well known in this area and beyond. He's a retired attorney and a well-known scholar of Civil War history. He helped me with a long story I wrote for the Knoxville Mercury about 6 years ago. For the sesquicentennial of the Sultana disaster. I tried to tell as much of the story as I could in 3,000 words. But he invited me to join a sesquicentennial gathering of Sultana descendants at the monument there at Mount Olive in South Knoxville for a very memorable ceremony of the Sultana disaster. It inspired me. I went back there several times after that, and I was inspired to include the Sultana Monument in our historic Knoxville guide, the Curious Visitor's Guide to the city, which we put out about 2 years ago, and also included in our driving tour of South Knoxville that we put out, and has been, I think, the most popular of our driving tours, and also the longest during that we came up with these series of driving tours for the shutdown, things that you could do safely without being around crowds last year, and that's one of the essential stops on this South Knoxville driving tour. Anyway, Norman Shaw is a retired attorney, founded the now venerable Civil War Roundtable. I didn't know this when I first met Norman. This was, the Civil War Roundtable has been around, much talked about for most of my adult life. And I've been to some of their meetings over the years. But Norman Shaw, you may not know this if you just meet him, but he founded the organization, the Civil War Roundtable here in Knoxville. And also the Association of Sultana Descendants and Friends, which is an interesting organization that kind of echoes the work and gatherings of some of the original descendants and friends. But without further ado, I'm going to turn the floor over to Norman Shaw, who has a great show set up for us, and I'm really looking forward to this one. I learned something from every episode we do, including the ones I do myself. But I'm expecting to learn a lot more than usual tonight from Norman Shaw and what he's learned over the years. But Norman, take it away.
Okay, thank you very much. I always read faithfully Jack's columns in the Mercury and in the Metro Pulse before that, so I feel like I know him. We were just talking. I think we met only twice. Once at the 2015 ceremony that he was referring to, and then I think one other time he had a program at the National Cemetery. So I appreciate everybody that's tuned in, and appreciate Paul James, the tech guy. He's helped me put this slide together, this PowerPoint, and I gave him the slides, and we got it put in the order for tonight. And it's a little bit different than I usually do. I'm going to try to keep this to 45 minutes, and I added a few slides and took a few out, so that may throw me a little bit. About have my talk just about memorized from giving it over the years. So we'll see how this goes. But so right now, I'll just thanks for everybody tuning in, and the several there I recognized. But the Sultana Disaster, what was that? It's the worst maritime disaster in American history. It's the steamboat that you are looking at now as the first slide, that, as you can see, is heavily overcrowded with Union POWs from the prison camps at Cahaba and Andersonville. And it went up to Memphis, the next stop, and then 7 miles above Memphis, it exploded, had a boiler explosion about 2 o'clock in the morning, and which resulted in about 1,200 died, and about 2,200 on board. So the figure that used to be kicked around, and you see written a lot, is that the total death was about 1,800, 1,700. But author Gene Saliker has been researching the Sultana for about 35 years, decided to just find out for sure how many people died. So he has a extensive list in the back of his 1996 book that he revised and updated, and checked out every person on board to see what happened to them. And he's able to verify that 1,200 died, and not the 1,800 that we've heard about. The 1,800 would have given us a total higher than the Titanic, which lost 1,500. But with the revised figure, it's less than Titanic, but still the worst maritime disaster in American history. For a steamboat that had an official capacity of 376, although it was not unusual to these boats to be contracted and have maybe as many as 1,000 men on board. But by greed and mistake, this steamboat had like 2,000 soldiers on board. So that's it in a nutshell. I guess the best way to tell the story is to start with the last voyage of the Sultana, which had a route from St. Louis down to New Orleans. And we'll go to the next map there. We'll see this image again a little bit later in the talk. But this came out of Gene Saliker's book, and it's a great way to understand the story. The Sultana's route was from up there in St. Louis at the top of the map, all the way down to New Orleans and back, plying its trade of delivering passengers and cargo up and down the river. So it left St. Louis on April 13th and came into Cairo, which was the next stop down the river. And I said Cairo, it's really pronounced Cairo, but we a lot of people say Cairo, but it was pronounced by the locals as Cairo. And it pulled in there on Good Friday, April 14th. And if you know your Civil War history, you know that back in Washington, April 14th, Good Friday, was the date that President Lincoln went to Ford's Theater with his wife and was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth, shot in the head and lingered through the night, and died about 7:30 the next morning. So the Sultana just happened to be at Cairo when the news arrived by telegraph the next morning. And the country was immediately notified, and the newspapers there in Cairo printed some special editions. So Sultana was pulling out early that morning and got several of those editions to spread to the towns below them, because the Civil War is still going on. Lee surrendered in April 9th, but that was over in Virginia. So the Civil War is still going on in other parts of the country, and there's no telegraph service in the South. So they were going to take these newspapers down to the other stops as they went down the Mississippi River. So they were a messenger of death. And that's what they did. They went down to Memphis and they dropped off some papers. And then that was, the news spread like wildfire, and the churches started ringing the bells. And the sad news was spread that the president was assassinated, the first assassination in our country's history. And then it went on down to Vicksburg, and you can see where I circled there, and dropped off some newspapers. And right there is where the captain of the Sultana had another interest in mind. He wanted to get a load of these Union POWs on his boat when he came back from New Orleans, because the Army paid the captains, the owners of a steamboat, so much per man. And Captain Mason expected to get about 1,000 men. So he went to talk to the head of the quartermaster department there, Colonel Hatch, to make this deal that he would be guaranteed soldiers on the return trip. And he went to the right person, because Colonel Hatch was basically a crook who stayed in the Army because of the influence of his brother, who was the Secretary of State in Illinois. And of course, that's where President Lincoln was from. And his younger brother got in trouble 2 or 3 times and probably would have been kicked out of the Army, except for the influence of President Lincoln, who didn't do anything wrong. But, you know, if he may send to a board that's here in the Hatch's case, a letter that says, "This is a fine man, I've never known him to do anything wrong," and that can have some influence. So anyway, he made sure he was going to get those troops when he got back. So the other thing that's good about this map, you can see where I circled Andersonville in Georgia, and Cahaba in Alabama, and Vicksburg. These soldiers were coming, these POWs, the Union POWs, were coming out of these Confederate camps. Andersonville, we've heard a lot about the tragedy there. And Cahaba is less known. Their maximum number of prisoners were about 3,000. I think Andersonville had up to 30,000 at one time. But the war's winding down, so only about 5,000 came out of these 2 camps to go home, send them home. And it's just logical to send them to Vicksburg, where they had transports going up down the river, and put them on a steamboat, send them up to Cairo, and get on the train and go to Columbus, Ohio, at Camp Chase, and be mustered out. So it's a sensible plan, and this just shows that fairly well, I think. So the Sultana went down to New Orleans and came back, and here's where things started going wrong, because as it was coming back, it had a leak in one of the boilers. It had 4 boilers, and a leaky boiler is a dangerous situation, because it's not unusual for boilers to explode on the river craft, the steamboats. So I had to slow down and kind of limped into to Vicksburg. But when I got there, the Captain Mason sent his chief engineer to find a boilermaker to repair this problem with one of the boilers. Which he did. Now, there's where I got things out of a little order in my mind, because I want to go back to Cairo now. And Paul was nice enough to send me an email with these slides in order. So I got to go back to here. I skipped this. This is the painting I really like. This is the my Michael Boss. And it's the Sultana coming out of Cairo, as I was mentioning, to go down the river. And what I like about this painting is that it shows the Sultana without it, like other paintings, when it had just exploded or it was crammed with men. This just shows the Sultana kind of its natural state. And there's some things here I can talk about that help you understand things later when I mention different parts of the boat. But in the stern, you can see the American flag there. It's in half staff, indicating the loss of the president. In the bow, the front of the boat, on the second level, you'll see these black U-shaped hangings over the railing there, on the railing. That's black crepe, which also is to indicate there's been a mourning of a loss in the country. So that was, this is accurately depicted by the artist. Also going back to the end of the boat, the stern, you see a small little yawl hanging from, well, there's one on top, yeah, and there's the other one hanging from the back. These are only 2 if you want to call them lifeboats that they had. They're not, I don't know if they're really meant to be lifeboats, but they were transportation really to other places if the boat was docked. But that's all they had in case there was a disaster. And then on just the stern of the boat, the second level, you see those looks like little windows there on the back of the boat, right there. Yeah, that's the cabin area. And that's called the cabin deck, obviously. And so that's where the passengers were kept, the paying passengers. And this was off limits to the soldiers, but that's called the cabin deck. And of course, the main deck is the first deck you see. The second deck is the cabin deck. And if you look at the front of the cabin deck, you see all that open space there. That's where, these boats were built to take a lot of bales of cotton and other supplies. You can see supplies on the first deck. So you got the main deck and you got the cabin deck. And then the roof of the cabin deck is called the hurricane deck. It's where the smokestacks look like they're attached. But that's a tar roof right there. And I'm showing that because this is where all the men were put. They were crammed in every space they could find, and all this open area on the cabin deck in the front and the main deck. And then on the hurricane deck was basically just a roof. They're all crammed in there and basically barely had room to lay down. And then the next, you see those 4 cabins at the top. So you see the pilot house. And then below that, it's like a little cabin area, 4 windows, and that's where the officer stayed. Captain Mason had his quarters there with the officers, so that's called the Texas deck. So this helps to demonstrate different parts of the boat we'll be talking about later. So, all right, now let's go ahead and go back forward to the next slide here. So I was talking about. Okay, let's see here. Okay, this is fine. We're talking about Mason had pulled into Vicksburg and trying to get the boiler fixed, and he got a boiler maker to do that. Except he didn't want to work on it because he said it'd take 2 or 3 days, but Captain Mason couldn't wait that long because he had missed these soldiers and missed the bonanza of payment from the Army. So they said, can you do a Band-Aid approach, just fix it temporarily till we get back to Cairo? And the Boilermaker reluctantly agreed to do that, and he worked, but it still took him all night to work on it. So it'd be ready to go the next morning. And this is the 24th was the loading of the Sultana. And it took all day to do that, started in the morning, and they were at a place called Camp Fisk, which is 4 miles east of Vicksburg. This was a special camp where these soldiers were brought to recuperate, they just got out of these terrible prisons. So, it gives them some time, some weeks to get good food and rest and good clothes and tents and medicine and the things they need to get back on their feet, or at least in that direction. So, but this camp was to be emptied by the decision of Colonel Hatch, talking with some of his subordinates, and so they decided to empty the camp. Now, 2 other steamboats had already preceded the Sultana and taken some loads. One took a load of 1,600 men or 1,300 men, and another one took a load of 600 men. So the decision was made that there's this probably a kickback deal between Hatch and Mason that they would load the rest of the camp onto this boat Sultana. And that's what this painting depicts. Only problem is you can see it got really, really crowded, and the men were on the boat, and then those are on and coming to were getting upset. You can see how crowded it was. And there was 2 other steamboats that came in. They were wanting some of these men, but the deal was made. It was probably most likely that Colonel Hatch was getting some kickbacks because that's the kind of guy he was. And so a decision was made to load up the Sultana, and there's no turning back. But they didn't know that there was more like 2,000 men in Camp Fisk instead of 1,000. 1,000 would have been comfortable. 2,000 was heavily overcrowded, which you can see in this painting. This painting is on the flood wall down in Vicksburg itself. If you want to see this, it's a very large mural on the flood wall. The flood wall has about 35 large panels. Each panel with the painting depicts the history of Vicksburg. And so this was done to recognize the loading of the Sultana, and our association went down there to help unveil this massive painting, this mural, several years ago. So it's basically taken from the one photograph we have of the Sultana. He just worked off of that. And you can see the men going across there in a single line on what's called the wharf boat, which is how they access the Sultana itself. And you can see how crowded it is. The men are really crammed and all on the hurricane deck, in the back of the boat, in front of the boat, and just everywhere. So this is if you ever go to Vicksburg, you need to check this out, and the whole all those panels. I think there's about 35 of them. So this depicts the Sultana pulling out at night. It took all day to load them off the 24th, but they finally got it done. And even Captain Mason was a little concerned and upset. Matter of fact, let's go to the next slide. We can see Captain Mason. This is a youngish looking fellow. I think he's about 34 years old. He'd been captain of several boats. He's the one that was cutting the deal with Colonel Hatch to get income for the owners of the boat, and he was a part owner. And he even got upset himself when he saw how overloaded it was, and tried to stop the loading, and he couldn't do it. The orders had been placed and there's no turning back. And he was seen in the saloon as the boat was pulling out, and was overheard to say he would be willing to give all his earthly possessions if they could get to Cairo safely. And of course that didn't happen, but he saw the danger. So, but anyway, they pull out, and up the river they go. The men are crammed in, but they do have food on board, and they only have 2 or 3 more days of discomfort for their home with their loved ones. And they said, well, we can handle that. We've survived the war, we survived the prison camps, we can survive 2 or 3 more days of discomfort. So as they went up the river, let's go to the next slide, and you'll see the picture of Major Fiddler, the 6th Kentucky Cavalry. He was one of the prisoners, and being a major, he was put in charge of the men themselves on the boat, where they should go, and I'm sure he took care of other things, such as how the food would be distributed. Any issues coming up with the men themselves was his responsibility, of course, working with the captain. Major Fiddler had only been captured a few weeks earlier. He was part of the Wilson's raid into the Deep South that eventually had a battle at Selma on April the 2nd, and he was captured before that with some of his men, and he never made it to the prison camp. He was actually put in a county jail, and so from there he went to Camp Fisk, and was in good health, and with his rank, it was just a natural choice to choose him to be in charge of the men. Unfortunately, he died trying to rescue a lady in the water, her daughter. He was on the boat with his lieutenant, and a woman came running up, a young woman, said, oh, please help rescue my mother. She's in the water. She's drowning. And he jumped in to save her, and he drowned himself. He was never seen again. So one of the many tragedies of the story. Go to the next slide. And this is Captain Friesler, 58th Ohio. He was assigned to take 22 of his men to be put on the boat for security. His men would be armed with their rifles, and just in case there were, security was needed, maybe a fight amongst the men, or some kind of disturbance, or also there's still a threat of saboteurs and guerrillas. And so he was in charge of, we'll just call it security, assignment he didn't want to do at all. He wasn't happy about getting this assignment. He did survive. His 22 men, only a handful survived. So they go up the river, making the inland port stops. And the last stop before Memphis is Helena, Arkansas. And this is, we'll go to that slide. And they came in here at 7 o'clock in the morning, pulled up the wharf boat there, and, doing the usual exchange of passengers and cargo. So they were there a few hours. And what's wonderful about this photograph is the only one we have for posterity of the overloaded Sultana. And you can get again, a good view of the men crammed on deck. Also, this is the entire photograph of the Sultana. And I know that because if you look in the bottom left-hand corner, you see this image, kind of a ghost-like image. If that, you see that man there? Yeah, that's him. I call him Ghost Man because he looks ghost-like. And what I believe is happening there, that's a soldier. I feel because of the dark part of his upper clothing and the light colored pants. He's probably a soldier walking towards the photographer. And because back then, if there's any movement when pictures being taken, it would be blurred. And when this came into Helena, it just happened to arrive at near the photographic shop of T.W. Banks. And being a good photographer, he knows the Kodak moment when he sees one. So he got his tripod out and set up for taking the picture. And I believe he took it on the top of the levee. It's the flood stage. The whole Mississippi River was at flood stage about 3 miles, and also Helena itself was flooded. But he found a place here to take the picture, and the men saw him doing that. So being young men, they all wanted to be in the picture, and they all went to that side of the boat, and they almost capsized it. And so all the captain and fiddler just told them quickly to get back. They're going to tip it over. But this is wonderful that we have this for posterity. And then a few years later, like 2016, another version of this same photograph surfaced. A lady bought it at a yard sale for a few dollars. And then she didn't know what she had, and she investigated, and she found out she had something very important. Even though it's the one image, there's some reason is a very vivid image, which we're going to go to next. And she found an auction company and sold it for several $1,000s. So here it is, and you can see how much sharper it is. You can see the soldiers better. You can almost see their faces if you zoom in. You'll notice that the Ghost Man is gone because a lot of the photographs of this picture crop it off on the left-hand corner and at the bottom and on the right. So he's gone, but you get a better idea of the situation there. So a few things to point out. If you look at between the two smokestacks, the braces, the lower brace looks like a dot, but what that is elk antlers. And what that means for the people looking for a fast boat, this means this is a fast boat, because Captain Mason liked to race other boats. And if you win a lot of these races, you're awarded these elk antlers. I don't know who awards them, but that's what it's there for, to hopefully get more passengers and people put more cargo on their boats to send it up the river because it's a fast vessel. Some other things that are a little easier to see. If you go to the back of the boat, the stern, where they have that little yawl hanging over the side, you'll see some men there well, that's the bow. Go back to the stern. The stern now is to our right. See the yawl hanging there, and there's some men sitting on top of the railing with their feet dangling over the side right there, and there's some even at the top. But if you go a little bit left to that railing, you'll see some horses. You'll see one or two horses' heads right there, two heads of horses just over the railing. There were 100 horses and mules in the Sultana, and they were not only there, but this round part, the stern of the boat inside there, they also had them in there, and the bottom part. So there's that. And one other thing I think I'll point out is if you look at the paddle wheel itself, the casing to it, there's some planks removed. And as you can imagine, with this many men on board, what are the sanitation facilities? Well, they didn't really have any. So being soldiers and being creative, they went to the casing there and pulled some planks out and made that a latrine. And I think you can see one or two guys sitting there right now on the casing. So those are some things that to point out in the cabin area. Wait, mute that. The cabin area, you can see that again, and again, that was off limits to the soldiers. They could not go in there for protection of the paying passengers. So, all right, let's go to the next slide. I got a phone call. It knocked off my slides on my phone, but I'll get it back on here in a second. So this is an idea of what the Sultana looked like after it exploded. After it left Helena, most of those people had less than 24 hours to live. The next stop was Memphis. Memphis, they did the usual exchange of passengers and cargo, and then went across the river and got a good supply of coal, and then started up the river. And when it got to be 2 o'clock in the morning of April 27th, there was just a vast explosion in the boat, and that's where 3 out of 4 boilers exploded. Most likely the weakened boiler was contributed to the cause. What happens a lot when the boat goes back and forth is that different parts of the boilers are exposed as the water slushes from side to side, and when the water slushes back, it hits the hot steel and creates extra steam, and that's extra pressure, and lots of times that results in an explosion. But Harper's Weekly, they can only go on descriptions. They obviously didn't have a photograph, and I think this does justice to the situation. You see all the men in the water, some in the stages of drowning, others hanging on to barrels or whatever they could grab to float. You see in the bow of the boat, they're jumping off from the top level and the bottom level, which is accurate. And the flames, there's a nice breeze blowing down the Mississippi. And after the explosion, there was a hole in the center of the boat, and the coal that was burning burning fires to keep the water boiling. The coal was scattered everywhere, and the boat quickly caught fire and probably looked something like this, although it started in the middle of the boat and spread. There might have been a chance to put the fire out, but there was like 33 buckets on board. They had sand in them to be used for fire, but nobody saw a need for that. And the men had to get water, so they used the buckets to get water during their trip. The only other thing that is not quite right is that both those smokestacks collapsed. One went forward and the other went backward. But I think this gives a good idea of the horror of the situation that the men found themselves in. There were descriptions by several survivors. There's a book that one of the survivors put together with submissions from men who lived through this, of what they experienced. And there's several descriptions of hundreds of people in the water churning. The water's churning because of the people thrashing and hollering and screaming and cursing and praying all at once. So it's just a horrible scene. And I think this gives you some kind of idea of that. We have several stories of survivors. And let's go to the next slide here. This is where I'm going to do a little concentration on the 3rd Tennessee Cavalry. The 3rd Tennessee Cavalry was a regiment from the Knoxville area. And of course, this being a state that seceded, I think many of us know that East Tennessee had a lot of people that were for the Union, pro-Union. And that's where they got these men from the Knox County and the surrounding areas. The person that I pay a lot of attention to is Ples Keeble. His name's Pleasant, Ples for short. He and his brother were on the Sultana on that hurricane deck we were talking about. And when it exploded, Ples went to look for his brother because they were different companies, so they weren't together, and he couldn't find him. His older brother John there on the right. So John was never seen again, and he perished. So Ples kept his head, and when everybody rushed off the hurricane deck, pell-mell down the steps into the water, he couldn't swim, so he stayed back and he hung on to the railing so he wouldn't be carried away with the masses. And when he saw his chance, he jumped into the water, but he didn't have to go very far to get to part of the housing of one of the paddle boats had fallen over, and it made a nice raft that he shared with several other men. And there was an eyewitness how one of the mules, like there was 100 mules and horses, one of the mules tried to get on the raft, and he was seen beating the mule off with a piece of wood to not upset the raft. So I always say, well, he was more stubborn than the mule. So that's a story I like to share about Ples, and we're going to see him a little bit more in the program. One of the other survivors was John Simpson. We're going to go to next. And he was also in the 3rd Tennessee Cavalry. What's impressive about him, he looks like he's about 14 years old, and maybe he was, but and he obviously lied about his age to get in the Army. He may have been 16, but very, very young. He was on the top deck also. During the explosion, he was sent airborne. So he just woke up in midair and splashed down away from the boat, which probably saved his life because he was away from all the people who couldn't swim, and they're grabbing swimmers and pulling them underneath. And he grabbed some debris that came with him from the explosion, and he floated to safety. So one of the other people from the 3rd Tennessee Cavalry is coming up next, Elsie Huffaker. And you can see the cavalrymen, they have the yellow trim to their coats, and they all, at least a lot of them, like to pose with a pistol across their chest. So Elsie Huffaker, I don't think having special stories, but he survived obviously floating on debris, and made it down. I'm not sure where he was picked up, but he survived. And the reason, this is where I've changed my program a little bit. I've not used Jesse before, but I met, when I first got into the Sultana story in 1987, I got to meet the last surviving child of these three that you just saw there, John Simpson, Ples Keeble, and Elsie Huffaker. And then when we had our first informal meeting at the Sultana Monument, which is just to the right of the screen, each of the last surviving child of each of those men was at that gathering. And that's going from left to right. That's Ples Keeble's son, Cy Keeble. This is next one is John Simpson's daughter, Mrs. Bloom. And on the right is Elsie Huffaker. And I didn't know she existed. She just heard about our gathering and attended. And so I took this picture that I'm very pleased with and proud of. What's happening here, this is 1987. Our organization officially started in 1988, which I call the first official meeting, because at this informal meeting, I got everybody's name and phone number and addresses. No really internet back then, and wrote everybody letters to have a formal meeting in 1988 at the Mount Olive Baptist Church, the church that owns the monument, Sultana Monument. This is a result of an article that came out in the paper by Fred Brown. A lot of you know that name, about Cy Keeble, and I asked to put a little piece in there about if anybody's interested in starting a Sultana Descendants organization, please meet at the Sultana Monument. And his article came out on Sunday, and my little article said meet at 3:00 that afternoon, the same Sunday. The paper came out, and I wasn't sure if anybody would be there, but as you can see, we had a nice little crowd of about 50 people. So very pleased with this photograph, and all very nice people. Let's go to the next slide. And here's one that I've inserted in this program of one of the 3rd Tennessee Cavalry members that did not live, Spencer Williams. And I mentioned him because when he did not return home, the sad story that these families never saw their loved ones again, even though they thought they'd see them in 2 or 3 days. his family put out a wonderful memorial stone that's in a cemetery that's only about a quarter of a mile from Mount Olive Baptist Church. And next slide is going to show you that monument, memorial monument to him. This tells me that probably the family had some money, had a little bit of wealth that they could put up such a nice stone like this. As you can see, it says in memory of Spencer Harrison Williams, date of birth, a consistent Christian and a loyal soldier, lost his life on the Sultana Disaster, April 27th, 1865. So it's all there. So it's just a wonderful monument. The cemetery is basically abandoned. It's owned, it's part of a larger tract that the owner has. It's not developed, but nobody's taking care of the cemetery. I've gone out a time or two along with another gentleman, a doctor in town, and we've cleaned that up a little bit so it's not totally overgrown with briars and weeds. That's why you have a clearer picture of this without with the growth cut down. So anyway, let's go back to the story. After the Sultana disaster, we had men that survived in different ways. Some of them just floated into the treetops on the Arkansas shore because it was a flood stage and they had to wait there till they were rescued by boats the next day. Some actually floated down to Memphis. Wesley Lee was the first soldier to float to Memphis, and he was crying out for help, and he alerted the town that there was a disaster. And there were people out that early in the morning, maybe 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock in the morning. And then they started getting boats out to rescue people floating down to Memphis. And some of them actually floated down to Fort Pickering, which is below Memphis, and rescued there. Right after the explosion, the Bostonia II came around the corner and rescued people. It was, I'm sure, quite a scene with all the boats, and there were some war boats also in Memphis rescuing people most of the next day. And they were taken to the Memphis hospitals. Memphis was basically a hospital city for the Union Army. And so it was, if you're going to have a disaster, it's a good place to do it because there was 5 or 6 hospitals and a soldier's home that they took people to. After the disaster, there was 3 investigations. We'll go to the next slide. And the one person that was blamed for all this was poor old Captain Speed. He had actually volunteered to help out with the loading of the troops. Just as a nice gesture, he was at the Camp Fisk. He was helping to count the men, or at least organize the men to be put on the trains that were sent 4 miles on rail down to Vicksburg and loaded on the Sultana. And somehow he got all the blame. He was the only one that was court-martialed. The 2 charges were fairly weak, something like dereliction of duty, and was actually convicted. There was a 6-month trial in Vicksburg at the old courthouse, and that courtroom is still there, and some of the furniture is still there. And after 6 months, he was convicted, but that was later reviewed by the Judge Advocate Holt. He's basically the top attorney for the whole army, and he overturned the conviction because he knew that Speed was just basically a scapegoat. And so appropriately, he was freed, and he later became a prominent citizen in Vicksburg. But the tragedy is that nobody was held responsible for the worst maritime disaster in our country's history. After the war, Sultana kind of got forgotten about, and was pushed back to the pages of history because there's so much going on at the time with Lincoln's. Not only was on his funeral train going back to Springfield to be buried. John Wilkes Booth was assassinated on the He was killed in a barn on the 26th of April, right before the Sultana disaster. Joe Johnson surrendered his rebel army on the 26th. So there's just a lot going on because people were tired of all the death and destruction. So the Sultana got pushed to back pages of history. And the survivors were upset about that, and their main goal was to keep the story alive, which is what our organization is doing for these last 33 years, keeping the story of the Sultana disaster alive. And we've been working at it in a lot of different ways over the last 33 years, including have 33 annual reunions. Let me just go to the next slide. I guess I jumped ahead a little bit, but the 3rd Tennessee Cavalry was captured by Forrest on the railroad raid in 1864, September. And they were sent to this prison camp. This is Cahaba, I mentioned earlier. This is Cahaba Prison, drawn by one of the inmates there, Jesse Halls, who wrote a book about it. And it's basically a converted cotton warehouse. And you can, when they put a stockade around it, you can see all the men crammed in there. And then it's the Alabama River next to it, which at flood stage actually came into the prison, and the men had to stand there in water for 3 days before the Confederates got them some wood to climb out on. And being soldiers and veterans, as they got up in years into their 50s or so, they started having reunions. So go to the next slide. I'm going to show you 3 photographs of local Knoxville reunions of the 3rd Tennessee Cavalry. This is one that I got from Cy Keeble, the son of Ples Keeble we saw earlier. I visited him, and he had these wonderful pictures, and he let me make copies of them. And I returned them to him. And when he passed away, we don't know what happened to his originals, but at least I have the copies to share. And this is probably in the 1890s. This was taken care of. You're looking at the age of the men and the clothing. You see a fairly good group there. Ples Keeble, he's on the front row to the right. He's easy to spot because he looks like Theodore Roosevelt, I think. And he always had like a scroll or a book in his hand because he was usually the elected secretary. About half these men have been recognized, or they've been identified by Gene Saliker when I put an email out to the Descendants. Do you know any of these people here? And about half of them have been identified now. So go to the next slide. I'm a little bit over time. I think we're going to wrap this up pretty quickly. This is another picture of the survivors. Now we're in 1920, and you see the ranks are thinning out. At this particular reunion, there's only 7. This is a photograph that is on the calendar of the Friends of the Library. They asked me for a quote, and I give a quote down there, which you can see in the right-hand bottom corner. And Ples Keeble, there he is again on the left, easy to spot, looking more like Theodore Roosevelt every day. He's got the little booklet in his hand. And his good friend, John Simpson, who turned out to be a pretty tall fellow, is second from the right there. And he's wearing his GAR medal. That's Grand Army of the Republic, which is the medal of the Union veterans. So then one last picture as the numbers start dwindling down. In 1929, we only had 2 left. And that was Ples Keeble, John Simpson. As you can see, there's that 1700 number in the news paper headline. This is from the Knoxville News Sentinel, dated April 28th. Last 2 members of 3rd Tennessee Cavalry in the Knoxville area. I need to qualify that because there's a fellow in 3rd Tennessee Cavalry who moved to Texas, and he lived to be till 1941. This is 1929. There's only 2 left. And then I saw on eBay this wonderful picture I had to have, and I bought it, and it applies to this reunion. I think this was taken by the photographer for the Sentinel, and I think they took these 2 images and put it in that article. But here they are, Ples on the right now, and they are sitting outside, getting ready to go to the reunion 1929. And I don't know why they both look so unhappy, but they were good friends, as you can imagine by now, through all these reunions. And one of the things that was important, well, I should finish this story. In 1930, Ples Keeble was the only person alive. John had passed away. And so Ples went to the 1930 reunion by himself and went through all the different rituals and programs, and elected himself to all the offices of the association. And then he lived, a few more months later, he did not live to attend the 1931 reunion. So now, one of the things that was important to these soldiers was to have a monument put up. They tried working with the federal government. The government wasn't interested, so they took the initiative themselves and came up with their own monument, took some donations, and they got the marble donated for free. It's pink marble donated by the Gray Marble Company that was quarried in the Farragut area. And so with a lot of work over several years, they were able to dedicate the Sultana Monument on July the 4th, important date, 1916. And here it is. Here's a photograph of the dedication. And you can see it's a fairly large monument. You can see the likeness of the Sultana on the front, carved in there. And what you really can't see, though, it has the names of all the Tennesseans. It's honor the all the men on the Sultana, but the only names carved on it are the Tennesseans. The totals of all the states are on the top above the likeness of the Sultana. And Tennessee had the second most from any state, with about 400, and about 365 of those were from the 3rd Tennessee Cavalry that were on the Sultana, but half of them died. And you can see fairly easily some of the veterans themselves. You see the gentlemen on either side, little groupings there of the elderly gentlemen in their Sunday best with their top hats right there on either side. Those are the veterans. You should be able to spot Ples Keeble pretty easy. He's just to the left of the monument. He's apparently a fairly short fellow. And that might be John Simpson next to him. I wouldn't be surprised. It's kind of hard to tell when they grow these long beards and they change and they shave them off. But that's you can see they're holding rifles, 2 on that side, and I think there's 1 on the right side who's holding a rifle. There he is. And also very interesting, I think, is that there's 3 Boy Scouts. They look like World War I soldiers because this was 1916, but we had not entered the war yet. But on the left, you see a Boy Scout there in the uniform. That's the way the Boy Scout uniform. And to the man where Paul is pointing, just to the left of him, and I think it's another Boy Scout. And not him, but the next one with the hat on. Okay. If you go to the right side, you'll see the Boy Scout there. And what I like about him, he's got a bugle in his hand. And in the newspaper account of this dedication, it mentions taps was played. So I like to think that taps was played by this young gentleman holding his bugle. And what happened here when they had this dedication, they were camping at the bottom of the hill doing something else. And somebody went down to them and said, would you like to participate in this important dedication that deals with history? A very good Boy Scout thing to do. And they said, sure. So they went up top of the hill and joined in and got in the picture. Now, our first reunion that we had, 1988, the first official reunion I referred to earlier. Oh, I'm skipping ahead again. Let's see what the Sultana Monument looks like today with the next slide. This was taken by Sally Walker, one of our members. I really like this picture. I think it's one of the best that I've ever seen. And you can actually read, I guess, because of where the sun was that day, you can actually read the wording at the top that says in memory of the men who were on the Sultana, and you see the different states and the different total numbers. Only Ohio had more than Tennessee. Ohio had 460 that I can see, and Tennessee had 385. So, and better, you can see the Sultana Monument better. And there's right underneath that, it says J.N. Simpson, promoter. That's John Simpson. So he had a lot to do with this monument. And you can start to see the names in the rows, and they're on the front and the sides and the back. But not all the names are on there. We've discovered about 12 names that were left off, and they've been added over the last 15, 20 years. So speaking now, going back to the Boy Scouts, at our first reunion, out of the blue, which in 1988, a man showed up and he heard about our meeting, and he says, I'm one of the Boy Scouts that was in that photograph. And there he is coming through the door. I'd forgotten about him. I've forgotten I had this picture to about a month ago, and I was going through some old pictures, and I discovered this photograph. And Gene Salaker came to our first meeting, and he had identified this man by name and just explained who he was. I don't know which Boy Scout he was. There's probably some more out there that weren't in the picture, but his name is Alfred W. Young. So we're great to have him remembered by this photograph. And that's me on the right there. I'm making notes. Maybe I'm taking roll. I'm not sure what I'm doing. I'm writing something there. So this is at our first reunion. So Now we've had since then 33 reunions, and the largest one was in Marion, Arkansas in 2015. This is Sesquicentennial Centennial. Marion, Arkansas was the town that is now closest to where the Sultana remains are, buried in a soybean field. And I think there's about 200 people here. So this is exciting to be treated so well by the town of Marion. They treated us well and gave us a Friday night dinner and gave us a steamboat ride up to approximately where the Sultana blew up. And Marion is just across the Mississippi River from Memphis. And we had just finished the cruise on the steamboat and the sun was setting, and I saw these stair steps and I said, well, this is the perfect place to take a picture. And I think it came out well. We had the sun shining on us. So there's about 200 people there. So that was a great moment. And the largest attendance we've had some other good attendance. The next year we came back to Knoxville, 2016, because that's the 100-year anniversary for the Sultana Monument. And that's the next slide. And here's a group photo. Try to take a group photo at every reunion. And here's one from that reunion, 2016. And you can see we had some reenactors there. Some men in blue uniform. Had a good crowd. I'd say probably 100 or so. We usually average about 80 or 90. And you can see everybody surrounding the Sultana Monument. So if you ever want to go see the monument, go to the Mount Olive Baptist Church Cemetery, go to the old part, and the road in the cemetery circles right around the monument, so you can't miss it. So couple more reunions here. The next one was in Cahaba. We talked about the prison. We actually had a reunion there in 2018. I regret that I didn't have a group picture taken on those bleachers there. Our photographer said we should do that, and I said I agreed with him. And I immediately forgot to do that. I had a lot on my mind. But this is not a bad representation of the people that were there. They're all the way from the left all the way around to the right. Those are our members. We're having a program inside the prison, and the lady in the center there, the one that's near the rope, she's reading a letter of, the tall lady. She's reading a letter from her ancestor who was in Cahaba Prison that was written from the prison. So we had 3 or 4 people read letters of their ancestors from Cahaba. So that was a good time. And then the next year we went to Helena, Arkansas, where we saw that iconic photograph. And we are of the Sultana, we are approximately, this worked out beautifully, we were approximately in the location of where the Sultana docked that day on the morning of April 26 in Helena. The river, this was of course in April, Mississippi River is at flood stage, and where you see water is usually dry, but that's the old riverbed. The river's now more, east towards Memphis, and more east, not Memphis, but more east. And then, so we just happened to be worked out. We were approximately in that location. So that was a great moment. Then finally, we'll wrap up with the Sultana Disaster Museum. This is a dream we've always had, and Marion has been very supportive of having a museum. Again, since they're the town closest to the Sultana resting site. This is in a kind of a small building. They have a good reputation, as you can see, of the disaster. This is from the Butler Insurance Company, Hartford Butler Insurance Company, that was started after the Sultana disaster. And this is based on the Harper's Weekly drawing, but this, as you can see, it's more colorful. And if you're ever in the Memphis area, go to Marion, which is a few miles across the river in Arkansas, and go to see the museum. And plans are in the middle of plans of having a permanent museum. And hopefully that'll come to fruition in the next few years. Marion has a great facility, an abandoned school, or a school that had to close down in 1938, school with an auditorium that has 22,000 square feet. So a lot of space for a very nice museum. And they hope it'll open in 2023. I think that's kind of doubtful myself, but let's keep our fingers crossed. Conference. So thanks for hanging with me. I went over a little bit, but it's still not that late in the in the evening. So I'll turn it back over, I guess, either to Paul or Jack.
Well, thanks a lot, Norman. That was fascinating, really was. And we'd are there questions out there? I always have lots and lots of questions, but one thing I've wondered about is why they haven't excavated the wreckage there more than they have. They discovered some part of it, and why not treat it like the Titanic and explore it? And,
Yeah. What happened is that after the boat, which I didn't really mention, it floated down and hit the shoreline of Arkansas and sank, and it was pretty much stripped of anything important of value, the boilers or just whatever. So there wasn't much there. And then when it was covered up with the mud, there could still be people dead inside the hole, and so it's kind of considered a tomb. The work done by Jerry Potter, he just did some drilling and probably spent a huge amount of money. He's the Sultana author in Memphis, and he has a book out, and another expert. He did a lot of drilling and just turned up enough from the drilling to feel confident that he found the site of the Sultana, which is now in this farmer's field.
Well.
Jack, in regard to the finding remains, when you have a boiler explosion, that's a rather catastrophic event. I think the pictures that we saw at the start of the conference showing the flames coming out of the ship looked like the ship or the boat was all intact. And after a boiler explosion, 3 boiler explosions actually, there wouldn't have been that much of the structure intact. That little small picture in the News Sentinel where there were only 2 survivors still there, that was probably a more accurate representation. It showed the whole ship blowing up. So boiler explosions were quite common in those days. We didn't have boiler and pressure vessel codes back then. And I think the life expectancy of steamships, if I recall correctly, was only like 2 years. All of them exploded. And you always hear about steamboats on the Mississippi getting caught on snags. Well, if they got caught on a snag and sank and the boilers went underwater, they'd explode. So whether the boiler was flawed and exploded, it didn't have enough order of magnitude safety factor built into it, or whether the boat was sinking and exploded. Boiler explosions on steamboats was very common in that era. And even years later, when they were used in electrical power plants, there were circumstances where a boiler would explode and a whole city block would just be demolished. There wouldn't be anything left. Now, those were much bigger, higher pressure, but in that time frame, they just didn't have enough margin of safety in the boiler designs. It wasn't until after they lost some city blocks that the American Society of Mechanical Engineers came up with their boiler and pressure vessel standards, and that kind of situation stopped happening. But during the Civil War era, boiler explosions on steamboats were very, very common.
Yeah, and I'll agree with everything you said. You're right. And the life expectancy was only a few years, and Sultana was a fairly new boat, about 3 years old. Well, actually 2 years old. Here's I don't know if Paul can get this, but I take this to all my in-person meetings so I can demonstrate the explosion that this gentleman just mentioned. I don't know if you can get that, Paul, or put me in the screen there. But
well, just hold it the best way you can, really.
Yeah. Okay. So we can't get any larger. Okay. I will. Right here is what the gentleman's talking about. This is what I bring.
That's good. That's good.
Yeah, I take this to my meetings and I use my pointer to show about the explosion and how terrific it was. And you're right, it blew a hole in the middle of the boat, and that's why I was explaining earlier. It blew a hole and it went up. The debris went up and came back down. Then it caught fire. and then the boat burned down to the main deck, and then it sank. So a lot of it was definitely destroyed. And this gives, I think, a good depiction, just like in the newspaper article, of what happened there. Although the explosion really went back at more of a 45-degree angle, and it took out the pilot house and about 3/4 of the Texas deck where the cabins are. So I'm glad that gentleman brought that up. I wasn't sure I was going to use this, but there you go. So thanks for bringing that up.
Hey, Norman, I have a question about the monument itself in Mount Olive Cemetery. Somebody at some point, that kind of tower on top, what's the story behind that?
Yeah, everybody asks about that. We can only guess. You see, it was not in the original picture when they dedicated it, and we're just guessing. You can actually unscrew that. I saw a picture one time where it was laying in front of the monument and looked like it had been unscrewed. It's a mystery, but our best guess is that was added to make the monument look more like a steamboat and like a smokestack, and it's actually different. It's not pink marble, it's white, so it doesn't even match. So it just added on. It's just a mystery.
And also a question from Cody, Joey Cody. I think he's gone, but he was asking about Ples Keeble's notebook. Did that ever survive?
I've seen it, but when he died, everything like those pictures and photographs, all that disappeared, which is unfortunate.
Yeah.
But I'm glad I made copies of the photographs anyway. Go ahead.
Yeah. Someone was also asking, Donna Wirtz was asking, she may have gone as well. I know obviously you started the Knoxville Civil War Round Table, but do you have a particular affinity with the story of the Sultana, or do you have a distant relative?
I get asked that a lot. Our association is we actually call it the Association of Sultana Descendants and Friends, because I would be a friend because I have no ancestor. Being interested in Civil War after about 3 years, working with the Round Table and participating in that, I stumbled across the Sultana story, and Cheryl Henderson with the East Tennessee Historical Society. I had was talking to her, and then she said something about, you need to see this gentleman in South Knoxville called Cy Keeble. His dad was on the Sultana, and I talked to him, and then I thought, well, this would be a great story for the newspaper. That's when I contacted the Sentinel, and they put Fred Brown on the story, who had moved over from Memphis. He knew Jerry Potter real well from the Memphis newspaper, and so he was excited to go interview Cy, and I went with him. But I just kind of stumbled across it, and there's a book called Out Transport to Disaster, came out in the 60s, and I just happened to see it in the library, and it just fascinated me. And then somehow I was talking to Cheryl, and she mentioned we had that connection, and it went from there. And then also the lady who was the three sitting in the chair, the lawn chairs, the one in the middle, she came to one of the roundtable meetings, just never met her before, just out of the blue. She came and said, I need to talk to whoever's in charge. And I was president at the time, and she came to me, she said, my dad was on the Sultana. Here's his picture, the original Civil War photograph. And she said, there's a wonderful monument out South Knoxville. You need to check it out. So that stuck in my mind too. So I found about the Sultana through a different couple connections, and I just followed up with it, and then started the Descendants Association.
Thanks for sharing that, the background. Any other questions for Norman? A great talk, Norman.
Okay, I really enjoyed it. That's my first Zoom talk, so.
Friday.
I did too. Yeah.
Got through it.
Right out of the day.
That's not your last. Yeah, I really appreciate it. That was fascinating.